Welcome viewers once again to The Power of Inclusivity, brought to you by Bayete Development Institute and supported by the Canadian Embassy. My name is Tino Chikuni, a human rights defender and an activist and a member of the Lgbti community. In today's episode, we'd like to talk about legal reform and policy reform. As we know, the Lgbti community in many countries, especially in Zimbabwe, face a lot of stigma and dehumanizing behavior based on the understanding or the perception of the laws within the country. In today's episode, we'll be trying to explore and unpack on what are the ways that the laws can be changed, amended, or reformed to be more inclusive of the Lgbti community and thereby empower them. For today's episode, I'm joined by Mr. Raymond Kuyala. Raymond, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tino, for having me here. Thank you, Bayete, for this opportunity.
Thanks so much, Ray. Could you please tell me a little bit more about yourself and the work that you do?
All right. My name is Raymond Kuyala, 30 years old. I'm a human rights practitioner as well as a public health programmer. I have a bias in terms of minority rights, specifically Lgbti rights, including rights such as rights to health, among other rights that are provided for within the Zimbabwean Constitution and other international provisions.
Thanks so much, Ray. So you've actually brought up the very topic I want to discuss today, the issue of human rights. So what is the legal context for Lgbti people in Zimbabwe? We're always hearing it's in the Constitution. We don't accept Lgbti people. So maybe can you please inform us or unpack for us what does the law say about Lgbti people?
All right. Thanks for that question. So with regards to the legal context, maybe briefly I can say there are laws that regulates LGBTQ people. So LGBTQ people, this is the umbrella in terms of various identities. But specifically for Zimbabwe, we have laws that are specific for same-sex men, that is gays and bisexuals. If you look at Section 73 of the Criminal Law and Codification Reform Act, which is Chapter 9.23, it specifies the criminalization of sodomy. So by sodomy, it's a consensual sex between two adult men. So that is one aspect that is usually used to criminalize people of same sex. But the same very law is a bit silent in terms of lesbian women. So now you can see the emphasis in terms of men and a little bit silence in terms of women. Yes. So issues of masculinity, issues of patriarchy, which also comes into play. Then you can make a reference as well with regards to Section 78 of the Zimbabwean Constitution, which is the latest one, the 2013 version, which specifies that any other individuals who are above the ages of 18 can be married. But then it delimits in terms of same-sex individuals. So subsection 3 then says individuals of the same sex are not allowed to marry. So those are the two provisions that are usually used to limit the exercise of rights for LGBTQ people. And with regards to transgender people, there is no law which is very specific, but usually, fraud is usually used by the police to say, because you are a man and you are masquerading as a woman, so they say it's fraud. You are not giving the actual details of who you are presenting as a woman, so you are tricking people. So it's now presented as fraud in terms of how they interpret it, but it's not specific to say this is fraud with regards to transgender, but that law is often at times used. So those are the three areas that are usually used with regards to limiting the rights for the LGBTQ people. Maybe I can make reference as well to Section 56, which is to do with discrimination.
Right.
So the provision gives certain classes to say no one is allowed to be discriminated on the basis of sex, gender, among other categories. And if you read further, it then says if someone is discriminated on the list provided above, then they can challenge the law. I know we are going to touch a little bit on how I'll expand that, but those are some of the issues, because in terms of that section, legal interpreters can say the list is illustrative, it's not exhaustive, and in that regards, it may or may not be used to further the rights of the LGBTQ people.
Right. And maybe just touching briefly in just 1 or 2 minutes, what about intersex persons? Because it seems like they're always the forgotten group in the LGBTI. Is there anything in Zimbabwean law around intersex people?
Yeah, so with regards to intersex people, the law does not really kind of criminalize, but the law somewhere, somehow through the Health Acts now talks about how intersex people can access hormones, among other things. But in terms of the legal fraternity, you understand that in terms of administrative justice. So if someone give birth today, we still have the binaries. Is your child male or female? So there is no longer, or there is no provision to include intersex people. So we are saying administratively they are not recognized, but in practice we do know that they do exist. So provisions from Registrar General and other administrative institutions should start to recognize these is a third sex, so that we start to have conversations around how possibly can we continue to expand a policy so as to allow for inclusivity.
Right. Because I think the Zimbabwean Human Rights Commission released a report around national identification, and they'd also mentioned intersex persons as well. Do you think, with the current politicians that are there, there's any opportunity to explore that recommendation?
So quite interesting is the fact that if you look at evidence that is often gathered, including the one that we just made a reference to, is often end up being moralized, often end up being politicized, but this is evidence that can be used to inform policy. If policymakers are to make reference and rely on such documents, we can make headways in terms of progress as a country. But usually it ends up being scrutinized, it ends up being politicized. So there is that need to objectively look at facts, to look at evidence and make sure that we are relying on such evidence to inform policies and development initiatives.
Thanks so much for that, Ray. And thank you so much, viewers. We'll be back shortly, just taking a short break. Welcome back, viewers, to The Power of Inclusivity, brought to you by Bayete Development Institute, supported by the Canadian Embassy. In this episode, we will be looking again at legal reform and policy reform, and I'm joined today once again by Mr. Raymond Kuyala. Raymond, I think one very important point that you had raised was what is the potential impact of these laws on LGBTI people? So you've mentioned a couple of laws and places where there is no law, but what is the impact of there being negative laws or there not being laws on the LGBTI community?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So with regards to these laws, laws are meant to regulate behavior, they are meant to regulate conduct. So in most instances, the implementation of these laws usually end up, having negative consequences, especially for the LGBTIQ people. For instance, the issue that I just mentioned, the issue to do with fraud, the issues to do with masquerading as a woman, members of the LGBTI, for instance, in this case, transgender people may find themselves, being unaddressed at the airports, because they are said to be masquerading. It also limits their comfort even to associate, the right to association, issues to do with privacy, because members of the community in general, the citizens, we feel they are justified to intervene. The police themselves sometimes misinterprets the law, because like I indicated that we have the law that regulates sodomy. But the police, if they suspect that someone is gay or bisexual, they think they are justified to stop that person and arrest them for being or suspected for being gay, but that is not a crime if you look at the Zimbabwean law. So it end up limiting spaces, freedom, it has a number of implications, even access to health, members of the LGBTI community feel are not free to associate, to access services, even to just travel, because the issues of documentation that you were raising then comes into play again. So largely I can say these laws somehow limits room for equal exercise of the rights that pertain to every Zimbabwean. Just issues to do with freedom, issues to do with even just reporting a violation that could have taken place, because members are then afraid to say, if I go and report that someone stole from me, they will just say, because you are gay, then the police will say, oh, you are gay. So it's now secondary victimization. So all those issues then obviously limits the potential even for members of the LGBTI community to exercise the rights, or even just for investment. We do have members of the LGBTI community. We have gone to other countries because they have experienced human rights violations. We have a number of reports from recognized organizations, GAOs. We have efforts by, Global Fund, UNAIDS, through the LEA process, which is the legal environmental assessment, which was done 2017, 2018. It really shows the impact of these laws in terms of the LGBTIQ people.
Thanks so much for that, Ray. And I'd like to maybe turn our focus on to looking at the people who make these laws or don't pick up on the gaps, which is the policymakers. Do you think our parliamentarians have any knowledge or understanding of the issues around legal inclusion of LGBTI people?
Yeah, so quite interesting is the fact that since the establishment of this country, and maybe the first republic, the former head of state and the presidium always made the reference to LGBTIQ people. There were so many terms, worse than dogs and pigs, and even the parliamentarians would know, and even up to date, these laws exist, and they know that LGBTIQ people do exist. Even the current president was once asked about issues to do with LGBTIQ people and said these illegal within our country. The parliamentarians themselves debate on these issues. They know these issues, but in most instances they don't debate and deliberate on these issues freely. Because once you do that, then people say, are you a member of the LGBTI? So it discredits the image of the individual. So people end up, withdrawing back, but they do know that issues to do with the LGBTIQ people do exist. However, knowing that LGBTIQ people exist does not really mean that they are well sensitized of the LGBTIQ issues. So someone may know about it, but they are still homophobic. So those are two different issues. Knowing about it and being sensitized enough to advocate for issues if they are, or to just create an enabling environment for a conversation.
Yeah, but in maybe a minute or two, could you maybe cover for me, has there been any efforts by any lawmaker to include LGBTI people through policy change or policy reform?
Yeah, so the last maybe resoundingly great efforts were just the debates that went on around the referendum around 2013, when the former head of MDC, Morgan Tsvangirai, started to talk about these issues, and it ended up being something else. And of late, we have the likes of Honorable Abode, who always talk about these issues within the parliament, but the lens is usually through health. So you may find that LGBTQ issues are coming into the parliament, addressing some legal issues, but through health. But we don't have Ministry of Legal and Parliamentarian Affairs working in harmony with Ministry of Health to make sure that these issues are addressed.
Okay. And just briefly, I think maybe it's time for us to maybe start thinking about what are the steps that we can take towards maybe making these spaces more inclusive and involving of LGBTI people. But we'll take that up in our next segment. Viewers, please join us shortly. We're taking a short break. Welcome back, viewers, to The Power of Inclusivity, brought to you by Bayeta Development Institute with the support of the Canadian Embassy. I'm joined here by Ray as we talk about legal and policy reform with regards to the inclusion of LGBTI persons. Ray, you had brought up a very good point in our previous conversation around information, knowledge, and what do people actually know about LGBTI people and how that affects the laws that are there in the country. Could you maybe unpack for me a little bit more around what knowledge or research is there around the way that laws impact LGBTI people in the country?
All right, thanks for that question. So with regards to how the laws affect the LGBTIQ people, we have evidence that is gathered through the shadow reports. We have evidence that is gathered through, the violations reports done by partners working within this space. But we have as well quite, a board of evidence that is supported by UN agencies. You have UNAIDS, you have Global Fund, Ministry of Health through the 2018 Legal Environmental Assessment, which documented the impact of these laws on LGBTIQ people. And like I indicated in the past, the impact is usually negative in most instances. LGBTIQ people, afraid to go and access services because they are afraid that if someone knows that they are a member of LGBTIQ community, maybe they may call the police. Maybe on their way going to access services, someone may suspect that they are a member of the LGBTI community and may take the law into their hands, and then violence takes place, all those instances.
Thanks so much for that, Ray. And I think you've brought up a very good point around access to services. The right to health is a very important human right. And I'd maybe like to understand what is the policy framework around LGBTI persons and the right to health?
So thanks for that question as well. So with regards to Zimbabwe, we have a constitution, which is the law which regulates any other laws. So any other laws which are not aligned or which are inconsistent with this law is regarded as null and void. So if you make reference to section 76, if I'm not mistaken, it makes explicit mention of the right to health. So this right to health is afforded to every citizen of Zimbabwe. So I like the fact that it's stated that every citizen of Zimbabwe have got the right to access health services. That section is not, stated in a way to say only heterosexual people, only this category of people, and it does not, delimit to say gays, lesbian, and other groups are not allowed to access services. This translates to the fact that every citizen of Zimbabwe, including LGBTIQ people, should have access to services, not only access, friendly and safe access to health services. So there are then other acts that are there that do support, the Constitution. You have Health Acts, you have, the Patients Charter, which can then be used, to unpack. You have ZINASPI, ZINASPI 3, ZINASPI Extended, which makes reference to LGBTIQ people as key population groups. And we have other policies as well that do exist. We now have, a training manual on healthcare workers with regards to key populations. Right. We do now have a job aid, which all in all, these are very important and rich policies, which if they are used, in a way that is impartial, can translate to, good services for the LGBTIQ people. But often at times we have, knowledge gaps in terms of the health practitioners, how to address issues, of pronouns for transgender people, So there's that need to continuously make sure that we are sensitizing the healthcare workers and making sure that the police environment itself. So there's a difference between having a police on paper and the police environment. So the police environment involves, for instance, the politics, the socio-cultural attitudes, the narratives that exist needs also to transform so that at least there's an enabling environment.
Thanks so much for that, Ray. And I think, you've brought up one set of players within the legal context, which is the actual providers of these services. But again, my mind thinks to judges, lawyers, these are all part of the legal process as well. And what do you perceive is their level of understanding or involvement with the LGBTI community?
So lawyers are very, important. Judges are very important. Prosecutors are very important, and the police. I will include the police. They are very important because they are the law enforcers and they interpret the law. So you have, a law that exists, but it is the work of the judiciary to interpret the law, to say what did the lawmakers thought when they were talking about this law. So you have, a number of classes which are then used to interpret the laws, sui generis categories, where you are then saying, is this the class or the category that was mentioned? If we are talking about, for instance, say discrimination, if you are saying on the basis of sex, religion, among other things, is this what the lawmakers were saying? It's the work of the judiciary to do that. So in as far as the judiciary is interpreting the law, my understanding is that almost all the lawyers or the judges, they have a certain understanding of the human rights, because they are supposed to interpret human rights. Whether they've taken a course in human rights at the law school or not, somehow their everyday job involves working on human rights and making sure that there is rule of law and there is impartial practice with regards to that. But obviously you cannot, rule out issues to do with their personal attitudes. You cannot rule out issues of socialization. You cannot rule out issues to do with their personal security and the political environment. For instance, if a judge is going to pass, a judgment that it is not allowed by the Constitution to discriminate against gays and lesbians, the environment will not allow for that, because the politics, the socio-cultural factors are not adequately prepared for that. So the judge will say, if I pass this judgment, I will have personal consequences. So they distance themselves because they are afraid to be said they are condoning homosexuality. So sometimes they really know what the law says and what needs to be done, but they assess the legal and political environment as well. So that need to continuously make sure that, yes, we sensitize the judges, we sensitize the lawyers, and we make the environment itself adequately prepared. So maybe I can refer you to South Africa. You know, there's a law on the paper, but in terms of the practice, there is the other extreme where, you know, corrective rape takes place. So we need to balance all those angles.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that, Ray, and thank you so much for the great information that you've shared with us. I think we definitely hear that there is a call for us to speak to our lawyers, our judges, and fellow legal practitioners, policymakers, to really make sure that our laws are inclusive of the LGBTI community. Thank you so much for coming through today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And thank you, dear viewers, for joining us today for the episode on legal and policy reform. We hope you continue to watch the show with the rest of us as we explore further into the power of inclusivity, brought to you by Bayeta Development Institute and the Canadian Embassy. Thank you so much, and see you next time.